Welcome to Trending in Education, a very special learning engineering, learning science series that we're kicking off here with an old friend who's been on the show back in its early days. I'm really excited to have Bror Saxberg back on the show. Bror is the founder of Learning Forge. He's also an amazing follow if you want to understand how brains work, how learning works. We're going to talk about parenting today, but it connects to a lot of different things. Bror, welcome back to the podcast.
Thank you, sir. It's great to be back on chatting with you as we've done a number of times in the past. And this is, I think, a particularly fun area to talk about, partly because kids are just fun. You have them. You have little people. I've had little people. They're now older people.
Yeah.
And so it's just fun to watch them change and move. But there's also lessons that we have learned from how development happens that are valuable there.
Yeah.
One thing, though, just to start, let me just begin with a note of total humility, okay? Raising kids, as you know, is extremely humbling. And honestly, the more you know about how it's supposed to work, the more humbling it is because it always goes off the rails. So let me just start from that point of humility, and then we can see what we want to talk about. So, we could start with some of the early stuff. We could keep going and see where we get. What do you think, Mike?
I think to start, it might be good just to reacquaint folks with you and your background and the type of stuff that you do. And then I think from there, we can jump into how that connects to parenting and how kids and all of our brains develop and so forth.
That sounds great. So, I started life as a research guy. I used to do human and machine vision research at MIT's Artificial Intelligence Laboratory. My daughter likes to say, before fire, before the iPhone. It was a long time ago. It's always hard to remember which came first, fire or the iPhone. And then over time, I transitioned from doing research on how brains work, minds work, to actually jumping into the world of ed tech in the mid-1990s. And ever since, I've just had a series of assignments where I've been using what we know about the sciences of learning and motivation to try to improve learning experiences at scale. So you and I met back when I was the chief learning officer at Kaplan. Before that, I helped start a learning company called K-12 Inc. I think it's now called Stride. And then, moved from Kaplan to actually head up learning sciences at the Chan Zuckerberg Initiative's education work. And then now more recently, a couple of years ago, I started Learning Forge, which is basically a little consulting firm to help all kinds of organizations think through how can you use learning science to improve the outcomes of learning and keep iterating over time as well. So that's what I've been doing for a very long time.
Yeah, and a credit to you that even besides us knowing each other from our Kaplan days, you are name-checked on occasion by our guests. Most recently, Nafez Dakak had cited Bror Saxberg, and I was like, Bror, you talking to me about Bror? And, besides that, also running into you at South by Southwest EDU, it's as if the stars are aligned and they are saying we need more Bror Saxberg in our lives here at Trending in Education. And then to your point, I am the father of a kindergartner now. So he's just about to turn 5 and he's in kindergarten. So, it's almost like we're coming up for air after the crazy run that is the first 5 years. That also involves a lot of brain development and a lot of stuff going on there. But we also wanted to kind of span parenting a little more broadly when we talk about this to say, as parents, how can we leverage some of the science that's emerged around learning, cognition, all those things that are out there? Where would you want to start that conversation?
Yeah, and I think both for just chronological reasons, but also for learning science reasons. Let's just begin at the beginning and start with the early stuff. There is a lot known now, much more than there used to be 30 years ago, about, how these little brains develop from the beginning and how crucial it is to get them started in really great ways, because it's like a down payment that just keeps paying dividends year after year after year when you get things started the right way. One really interesting resource is something called the Brain Story from the Palix Foundation, which is based up in Alberta, Canada. What they did was to try to digest a lot of early childhood development research and turn it into stories, basically, that are easy for anyone to kind of understand and keep in their heads. And so they drew on things like Harvard's Center on the Developing Child, research by Jack Shonkoff, but others as well. And so this might be a good place to just start
Yeah,
some of the stories that they tell. And if you just Google the Brain Story Palix Foundation, you'll find this.
I see it.
Um,
Yep.
and, a really interesting starting point to me is to think of doing good work with really young kids before they have language. One of the metaphors is it's like the foundations of a house,
Mm,
that if you can get that to work right, then everything else will go better over time.
right.
Don't get those foundations to be well built, it's tough later on because the foundations are still there. So the
Yeah.
foundations really matter.
Mm.
A second piece that's a really nice insight is this idea of serve and return. Because sometimes people think, look, little kid can't talk, so what's the point of talking to a little kid?
Is the kid playing pickleball with me? What are you talking about? Serve and
Yeah,
return.
and so can I, let me wait until they have language and then I'll engage with the kid, right? And it's
Right,
like,
right.
no, 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 no. That's not how language is acquired. What you want to do from the very beginning is engage repeatedly in serve and return with the kid's own attention. So if the
Hmm.
little person is looking at a teddy bear, then you look at the teddy bear and you talk about the teddy bear. If the little one is looking at their food, then you're looking at the food and you're talking about the food.
Hmm.
It could be they're just kind of randomly looking around,
Right.
but that's okay because the words and the language and the support you give them basically charges up their language system. It's
Hmm.
how, now we can use terms like neural network, and people all over seem to know what we're talking about. Didn't used to be the case.
Right.
But this is how you train a little human neural network, is by
Right.
exposing it repeatedly to language and reinforcement. And that's how you can get things going. The other thing it does too is it helps create agency, confidence, a sense of belonging, because you are paying attention to what they are paying attention to.
Yes.
And that again pays dividends long term because it's the baby's version of respect. And so that can help with resilience over time in terms of
Hmm.
the kid beginning to feel like I belong here. I'm a part of this, whatever this thing is over time.
Right.
So serve and return is that notion of just keeping going back and forth. And at first, you may not get language back, but over time you do. And it's really important to keep doing that. Frankly, heck, I'm still doing that with my kids who are 30 and 28 and
Right.
32.
Right.
It's like
Right.
we're still doing serve and return back and forth.
Yeah.
Um, Another piece that's really important is to understand the impact of stress on little kids.
Mm.
And there is good stress. Good stress is like a brief moment before you jump into playing soccer or, engaging or saying something to somebody else.
Stadjuk
I know,
Stodson, right? I'm in the sweet spot. I got a
yeah,
little bit of
yeah,
energy, but I'm not choking. I'm not freaking
exactly.
out. Yeah.
And the idea, it's just, it activates you. It kind of makes you pay attention. Even little people makes them kind of pay more attention. Then it's kind of
Yeah.
like, ooh, I have to do this. But it's temporary, and that's critical because the worst kind of stress is long-term, day after day kinds of stress. And of course, we're still post-COVID, and
Yeah.
the economy can be stressful for families, which
Yeah.
then create stresses for the little people and so forth.
Hmm. Hmm.
And that's one of the things, and actually Jack Shonkoff at this Harvard Center on the Developing Child was one of the early people to point out that the actual hormone that's activated in stressful situations called cortisol,
Yeah.
it can mobilize resources when it's just there for a brief period of time.
Right.
But over a long haul, being exposed to cortisol has all kinds of negative impacts on
Yeah.
your health,
Mm.
but also even on learning. That it turns out cortisol actually gets in the way of learning. It stops the neurotransmitters from doing their work to actually create change.
Right.
So you really want to shy away and solve problems with a little person that are high stress, that keep having stress running in their environment.
Right.
And in
Right.
fact, one of the things the Center for on Developing Children has been doing is trying to work with pediatricians and pediatricians' offices to look at levels of cortisol in kids and
Mm.
find you can even find long-term markers of cortisol in kids' hair, it turns out. So
Huh.
you don't need blood samples. You can actually do some analysis on hair samples to see that. And they're experimenting with that and trying to see if they can make that all work.
Wow.
And so that's a key thing then for parenting, is to realize it really makes sense to try to decompress at home,
Mm.
to kind of bring down stress levels. And, we all rely on our families for a variety of things, right? But when you
Right.
have little people in the home, the more you can be present and supportive and not negatively reactive, the
Right.
better it is for the little people to learn things.
Yeah. I've always thought of it, since I discovered the serve and return research, which is really interesting. I've always thought of it as almost like improv parenting, a little bit of
Mhm.
yes and where you're looking for
That is
some
right.
kind of signal from your kid. And I'll never forget when my son was a little past a year, I was holding him and he would just stare at this light over my shoulder and go, ooh, like just look, ooh. And he wouldn't make eye contact with me. And it was driving me crazy. But the reality is the fact that he was looking at the light, I should have turned around and said, "Ooh,"
It's a light.
but
Yeah,
instead
it's so
being that
bright.
I was hoping he would connect
Right.
with me, Bror, and instead the light was much more interesting at that age. But it is fascinating to me, especially the early age, how in some ways they're smarter than us. They're certainly faster learners. They're making more
Oh, yeah.
connections and
Oh,
they're
yeah.
assimilating their world around them much faster. And, so both being tuned into that so that you can return their serve, and then also being aware enough of yourself as a parent to realize I need to model calm. I need to model
Exactly.
the repose that will allow us to recharge. And at the same time, I think it's a good note. Be aware that cortisol and stress helps at times, and we do have to rally, and that's part of how we're wired.
Right.
But you just need to be able to turn the dial down from
Turn the
time to
dial down.
time.
And it's such an interesting point you make, and comes up, that modeling point in my mind comes up, the kids have tantrums, right? This
Yeah.
is the classic challenge of the 2-year-old in the movie theater or the grocery store or wherever is least convenient, on the doors down from the bus. That's the
Yeah.
moment where there's a meltdown and blockage and all this, right?
Right.
And it is a stressful moment, right? It just is. And the thing to realize, I think, especially the little kids, and there's another version in adolescence, which we might get to, but
Hmm.
for the little kids, they're not trying to get your goat. They're actually reacting to having too many things happening at once, to
Hmm.
being unable to make a decision, to feeling like things aren't going their way, and
Yeah.
they don't have, as a little person, the resources yet to kind of talk it through, or
Hmm.
have the patience to wait, or whatever it is.
Right.
And the key then is patience on the part of the parent, as you just said. And
Hmm.
it can be really hard because you are feeling the social pressure all around you, of people's eyes looking at you, and it's like, what's wrong with this person? They can't control their child, and et
Yeah.
cetera. But in fact, you really have to, you said, improv, right? You have a role to play in that moment.
Mm-hmm.
And that role is to be supportive, to potentially, yes, move away from the setting,
Right.
so you're not in the middle of everything, that you're somewhere else. That's partly
Yeah.
for your own well-being, but it's also just to help with getting the little person out of the multiplicity of stimulus
Yeah.
triggers that may have been part of what's going on.
Yeah, it reminds me of the idea of the redirect too, right? That's kind of like
Yes.
the yes and. It's like, yes, I understand where you are, but rather than doing this in the street or doing this on the bus, let's do it in a quieter
Yeah.
location over here because look at the toy in the window?
We're gonna wait for the next bus. We're gonna sit for a little bit here.
Exactly.
And then the other part is, these things, the storms always pass, right?
Mm.
And that's fine. And then again, depending on the age of the child and language capacity and so forth, it's actually a good idea later, not like on the spot, but potentially later, to even have a conversation about,
Mm.
hey, remember yesterday when you felt all kinds of emotions and it
Yeah.
was difficult for us to keep going from there? Do you remember what happened? And also, what can we do? What
Yeah.
can we do to not have that happen again?
Hmm.
Now, and the first time you do that, you may not get a lot out of that interaction, but that's
Right.
okay. Part
Right.
of what you're doing is modeling that it's not that the child is bad. It's just, yeah, this happens.
Right.
And people get very upset. And it's okay to talk about it later,
Right.
and then try to problem solve, right? And so
Right.
you're modeling that notion of, no, no, I still love you and I still think you're terrific. Let's talk about what happened because that's not great to have
Right.
this happen again. And let's see what can we do, either both of us, to do that better. And so I think that's a key thing to think through, that even in that difficult moment of a tantrum, you're actually still
Yeah.
able to provide modeling for the child.
Hmm.
Now, it can be tough. And, this is where, partners and friends and all this, spouses are great, is, when you get a little
Yeah.
distance with the child
Sure.
and you can blow up,
Right.
but not with the child.
Well, and
That's,
so yeah, and in some ways you're modeling again, saying like, I need a break. I need to
yes.
step aside for a moment, and daddy needs to cool off for a minute. But however we get to this point, Boris, some of us do make it to kindergarten. We make it to be like a parent of a 5-year-old. And then it becomes a new set of challenges in the next phase. If we're kind of following this progression as parents, then they get into those early elementary school years. And what is learning science? What is your background? Any advice or thoughts to
Yeah.
share about that phase?
Yeah, and there's tons potentially, but again, for parents, there might be a few things to keep in mind that are helpful. One is a little, I guess, cognitive science 101 here, which is, the way we all work basically is we have working memory and long-term memory that collaborate. So, working memory is the first stop for things coming through our senses. And so when we watch things and listen, the first place those things land is working memory. And working memory has a number of things that you could look at as limitations. It's narrow, it can't pay attention to too much at once. It can be slow to process what's going on. However, it's really creative. That's the place where new things get put together and new things happen.
Mhm.
And it's also the gateway to long term memory. This is where, repeated practice using your working memory gradually puts things into long term memory. Now,
Right.
long term memory has very different characteristics. If we only had working memory, it'd be a pretty hard slog, right?
Right.
But
And actually
long,
just real quick
yeah,
too on this is where the computer analogy of how brains work and how cognitive processing works is really interesting if you look at the history of cognitive psychology, cognitive science, where that was a real breakthrough. And then interestingly, it kind of went back in the other direction around neural networks now, where okay, we kind of understand a little bit how the brain works. How do we apply that to how computers work? We're not going deep on the AI conversation in this episode, but that is something we also talked about. And it is interesting to think
yeah,
about how we think about like memory banks versus, RAM is another way you can think about working memory.
working
Like
memory.
what are
Yep.
you actually processing versus what's stored as data? So some
From
of those
Hong
themes I
Kong.
think are interesting and they're deeply connected. Your background is not unique in the connection between cognitive science, cognitive psychology, and artificial intelligence research.
Yes, yeah, exactly right. And so the metaphors work both ways and have been helpful both ways. A brain is not actually a computer. However, the information processing ideas that grew up in the 1950s that led to things like computer languages,
Mhm.
as opposed to just ones and zeros being literally by hand put into, the vacuum tubes,
Right.
before, that notion of, well, we can describe information processing at a higher level, that led to what's called the cognitive revolution around learning about understanding, well, wait, we don't have to know what every neuron in the brain does.
Right.
Maybe we can study the information processing, knowing it'll be a lot noisier than what we can do in a computer.
Mm.
And that's where you have these models that have now been proven over and over again around working memory as one kind of information processing hub that minds have. And then long term memory, very different characteristics. As the name says, it lasts a long time. It also acts really quickly. It can recognize something or process something very fast. It can do many things in parallel.
Mhm.
It is also nonverbal. That's one of the interesting things about long-term memory. So, when you talk to somebody who's expert, whether they're kids or adults or whatever, often they don't know all their own expertise.
Right.
Somebody who memorized 150 Pokemon cards, it's just like obvious that's Squirtle or that's,
Right.
Pikachu or whatever, right?
Right. Right.
They look at their parent as an idiot because Of course it's Pikachu. What are you talking about? Now, I may be dating myself in terms of Pokemon references. That's
I
part of what
think
my
Pikachu's kind of evergreen. I think you're
it's
okay. Yeah.
it's a forever meme,
Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah. Yeah.
But so this is really important to have this distinction between working memory, which is verbal, which is where our
Yep.
self-talk lives,
Hmm.
and long-term memory, which is where we put things that become patterns and key resources that can get drawn into working memory for free.
Right.
So it's, looking at a chessboard, to me, I'm truly a bad chess player. Like, I'm not being, humble brag here. I'm like, what does a queen do? Right. I'm totally bad. Right. And so for me, just trying to remember the moves of the pieces occupies my working memory when I'm looking at a chessboard.
Mm.
Whereas somebody who's quite good at it will look over my shoulder and say, wow, don't you realize your queen's at risk? And I'm thinking, which one is the queen? Which one is the
Right.
queen?
Right.
The other person, they've already internalized the whole board at a glance,
Right.
and it's shoved right into working memory that, oh my God, this guy is about to lose his queen. And it's not even the pattern comes in. It's not like I have to
Right.
think it through. It's like instantaneous. Like,
Yeah.
another example I often use for adults is like driving. That you can drive to work and you're not thinking about driving. In fact, what sometimes happens to people is I will set out planning to go to place A, and then I
Right.
end up at a Starbucks
Right.
because I've been thinking about something else during the time that I was supposed to be driving to
Right.
place A.
Although that reference, I wonder about how GPS dependent we're becoming and how many folks would suffer GPS blindness. This is something we intentionally turned the GPS off just to make sure we can still generally
Navigate the
navigate the
world.
local
Yes.
neighborhood so you
Yes.
don't have to be
Well, and
reliant.
what's also interesting about that is, in a sense, if you keep looking at the GPS, you're continuing to use your working memory.
Mm.
So actually, you're going to have trouble planning your vacation
Mhm.
while staring at the GPS,
Mm.
right? So in fact, what you more likely do is, I know exactly how to drive to work or to Starbucks, right? So
Yeah.
I
Right.
just set out, and
Mm.
I don't even set up the GPS or
Yeah.
whatever.
Right.
But now what can happen is long-term memory can run driving for free, but it might swap cards. It might, instead of going to
Yes.
work, it
Yes.
could go to Starbucks.
Right.
And you might not even notice
Right.
that
And
your
that's kind
working
of,
memory is
yeah,
busy
that's like
doing
the
other
idea of
things.
being lost in thought, right? Like, so like you're going so deep into that stuff that the stuff that's for free is almost on the wrong subroutine.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So the reason this is really relevant for parenting and kids is there's some things that are happening for kids that come for free. I mean, like learning a language, both listening to it and speaking it. Man, you don't have to give these little people lectures, right? It just kind of
Yeah.
emerges because, in a way, the neural network is primed
Hmm.
to get languages. And there's all kinds of research about how cool that is and Noam
Yeah.
Chomsky's work. And yeah, same thing motoring around in the world,
Right.
beginning to get up and walk on 2 feet and
Right.
then grab things and manipulate and all that,
Right.
right?
So I just was at a 5-year-old's birthday party at a trampoline park. So
Oh,
I get what
you
you're
good.
talking about. Yes.
Yeah. And those things come for free. The trick is we sometimes get fooled into thinking, wow, all learning should be as easy as
Mm-hmm.
learning to speak or learning to walk or whatever. The problem is most of human learning is not like that. It's not pre-wired into it. So specifically like reading, for example,
Yeah.
speaking and listening, those are natural. They're just they happen for free. Reading is not natural. We don't have any machinery yet, maybe ever, that's evolved to
Mm.
help us with that kind of symbolic translation from
Yeah.
marks on paper into words that then, access all our speaking and listening skills. And so that means you have to do a lot of practice and feedback that in working memory
Mm.
to begin to create those fluencies in long-term memory
Mm-hmm.
that then give you for free once they're there.
Yeah.
This is the word with, this is the word elephant. These are the parts of this word that now I can put together and get right. You need that to be in long-term memory.
Right.
So when a new word appears on a page that you haven't heard before,
Right.
you can recognize parts of it. And so you can sound it out, which
Mm-hmm.
then kind of gets it into your speaking and listening parts of your
Right.
brain that are wired there.
And this
And
is like grades like 1 through 3, although increasingly
K
like
through
K
two,
K through 3 now too,
yeah,
because it does seem
exactly
like
right.
they built a lot more of the pre-literacy and
Exactly.
maybe some basic numeracy into K through 3, because there's a lot of assessments that then happen that
Right.
frequently are correlated to where you might go with the rest of your sort of learning journey from that
Right.
point. But it's really, if you're not caught up by grade 3 on basic literacy, there's a lot of work that needs to be done to catch you up, and you can really start falling further behind.
Well, and the good news out of the learning sciences work, really over the last half century, is we know a ton about how to help almost all kids reach that kind of fluency, have those key patterns in long-term memory by the time they're in second or third grade.
Yeah.
But you have to start early, and you have to start with the letters and sounds and
Right.
making the kid become aware of sounds
Yeah.
and
Well, this is
want
the other
that
aspect
connection
of
point.
read alouds is the other thing I've
Yes.
seen a lot more of, and reading stories to your kids and having books in your home. It does bring up some questions around equity, which I know is something you've thought a lot about, as well as, CZI and really throughout your career, is like, how do we figure out how to address some of that? Any thoughts or any insight on
Well,
that?
I think a key is, as you said, is you start from what we know about learning and also what's needed to be in long-term memory, and then
Mhm.
how does working memory, long-term memory work together? And then you look at the context, try to
Yeah.
figure out, okay, in this child's context, what are the key things that need to be going on? And one of the things you said, which is so important actually, is for reading and other things, you need a lot of information to flow into that child, not simply from reading, but actually from conversations, from
Yeah.
stories.
Hmm.
And for example, there's a great organization, the Great Books something. I can't remember what the last part of it is, but they have something called Junior Great Books, which are basically stories, kid stories, classic kid stories, together with suggestions for how to read through them and how to stop from time to time and ask some questions,
Hmm.
and ask questions about what has happened, ask questions about what is happening, ask questions about what is about to happen,
Yeah.
so that what you're doing is you're helping that child not just enjoy a story, because you do that too, but also perhaps in rereading it to then be thinking ahead and thinking about why did this happen and thinking about what's come before, as a way of helping to prime their ability to then be kind of analytic by using spoken words and listening faster than what the reading skills will get them. Now, eventually, they'll be doing the same thing with reading things, but you
Right.
can start them earlier. And then the other part of this is just having, information about the world and what's around them and culture and all kinds of things coming in. It's going to come in through their play and their conversations with everybody.
Right.
So no harm done in being a little bit intentional. My wife was a little over the top on this because she used to read the New York Times to our kids in the mornings as
Uh-huh.
part of the. That's a little over the top.
Right.
Although I admit, we are actually talking about maybe getting a subscription for The Economist for our 1.5-year-old daughter. We got to up the game a little bit, right?
Right.
But I would say part of this is, anywhere that you are around and living and working, serve and return
Mm.
is a great opportunity to keep talking about, what am I doing? Why are we here? What
Yes.
are prices? What are we buying here? Why do we need this? What are we going to
Right.
do with this? What do you think we should do with this?
Right. Right.
What do you think we should get next time?
Right.
And
Right.
so this is the same kind of back and forth, think about the past, think about the
Hmm.
present, think about the future. And that really, helps kids.
It does remind me of my wife is a user researcher who one of the methodologies that she uses is talk aloud, so while folks are navigating a website or whatever, they're talking aloud about what they do. And we're always joking that our 4-year-old is a perfect talk aloud subject because he's always just verbalizing what's actually going on in his head. But that's the type of, and I imagine we probably modeled that for him so that he learned it by
Yeah.
watching us. But any other advice on the early ones? Because then I'd be curious more since you have more of a window into my future here, where you've also navigated some of the teen years into
Yes.
leaving the nest years. But any
With
parting
humility.
thoughts for the
Yeah,
early?
the one other thing I would say is that math is harder for parents to support, most parents, than reading, because
Mhm.
reading is around. I mean, and again, it's really good to be conscious about the reading and to share what you're
Yeah.
reading and why you're reading it and how we're using reading to solve our problems and make decisions about where we're going and all this. Math is not as easily accessible, but in the same way, it's really important to try to make use of numbers visible. So
Mm.
there's all kinds of things you can do. And again, there's a completely natural free part of math that brains have around some number sense,
Mhm.
but it stops pretty early. It
Mm.
doesn't go very far. Things that you really need are things like number lines and
Yeah.
fractions
Mm.
and what's bigger than what and things
Mhm.
like that. And those
Mm.
are some down payments you can start to make by playing games,
Yeah.
by talking about prices and buying
Right.
things.
This is daddy's justification for having sports on the TV all the time because there's a lot of numbers on the screen. It's really in
And
support of his
talk about it.
learning, bro.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. This is like, give that baseball glove to your mother. Absolutely, because you're supporting, supporting her in her interests and all this. But also kitchen stuff,
Mm.
cooking is
Yes.
filled with fractions and
Ratios
numbers and
and
all kinds
yeah.
of
Mhm.
ratios and all that. And again, just the talking about it,
Mm.
even again, just like with language, you're not going to get on that serve and return. You're not necessarily going to get much back,
Mm.
but you want to keep talking about it as you're doing it and even traveling. How long will it take to get there?
Yes.
We're going to be halfway there in this amount, so that means we need to be ready for the next amount, right? And so we do that in our own heads,
Yeah.
silently and quietly. When do I plan a bathroom break in the drive and I'm going to be right? It's like,
Yeah.
no, no, make it verbal.
Yeah.
Talk it through to say, okay, in another hour, we can find a place to stop. That'll take us this much space and so forth.
Yeah.
And again, it'll seem silly in some ways with a little person who's 1 year old or 2 year old, but get into the habit of talking about the numbers as you keep going. So,
Mhm.
and the reason it is harder to get those examples, and so it's really valuable to pay some attention to where can I find spots to actually talk about numbers and quantity and
Yes.
larger than and smaller than
Mhm.
and notations of fractions and things
I
like
really
that.
especially for road trips, it does seem like there's some natural we're always thinking math, whether it's, time to destination, gas in the tank, speed limit. Like, there's a lot of numbers, and that's true probably of other contexts. You just almost to your previous point, you just take it for granted. It's all implicit knowledge.
And that's the thing. For the adults, it's already in long-term memory.
Right.
So it's, obvious and, don't need to verbalize it or in some cases get to the conclusion
Right.
with no verbalizations. But this is where it's good to get into the practice of trying to actually verbalize it. So,
Mhm. Yeah.
but so let's talk a little more about, kind of adolescence and things like that. There's actually a really fascinating article by a researcher at UCLA named Mary Helen Imordino Yang. That's a
Wow.
mouthful.
Okay.
Mary Helen Imordino Yang.
Yes.
The article, and people should go look at this. It's called "Building Meaning Builds Teens' Brains."
Mm.
And what she's synthesized and summarized is a whole bunch of research and practical implications that indicate that the adolescent years are a time when the brain really reopens for development.
Mm.
That, it's, and now there's good and bad here, right? How did my compliant, friendly, planful fourth grader turn into this crazed, lurching, impulsive eighth grader,
Yeah.
right? So,
Yeah.
I mean, it's not always pretty how this goes forward. But one of the things the research suggests is it is in that adolescent period, middle school, early high school, this is where kids become really open to and motivated by social inputs,
Mm.
inputs from their peers, a sense of what am I doing? Does it give me status in the
Mm.
world,
Mm.
especially among my peers, but just in the world generally?
Mm.
So there's terrific opportunities during that time. And we can talk more about that in a minute, but especially, and this article talks about this notion that you really want to help kids not only think concretely about problems and skills and why is this happening near term in terms of, crime in our city or whatever it is, but you actually also want to encourage them to think more systematically, larger thinking about causes, about
Yeah.
underlying reasons for why this person is acting in this crazy way. Why would that have come about now as opposed to earlier and so forth?
Hmm.
And it turns out in this article, it talks about how you can actually see the impact of that kind of back and forth between focused on kind of local concrete thinking, back and forth with broader, what are the implications of this in the world, in my life, to my family? It
Right.
actually changes how the things, networks of neurons called like the default mode
Right.
or other parts of the brain actually work together over time. And so want to give kids that opportunity to kind of cycle back and forth with that because this is the moment, the window
Yeah.
to make a huge down payment that will then last for the rest of their lives.
So I got about 6, 7 years for the brainwave monitors to come online so that I'll be able to just adjust the dials so that when I see the wrong, you're not in the default pattern, you should be. I'll just adjust the dial and that'll get the boy pointed in the right direction. I hope.
Don't know if that's going to be there in time for your
All right. All
five-year-old
right.
when they
All
get to
right.
be 12 and 10.
Yeah.
Um, but the other part of this that's worth saying is it's a little similar to what we talked about with tantrums in the younger set, which is you're going to have door slamming, you're going to
Right.
have shouting, you're going to have stuff like that, and it's particularly confusing because it seems like it wasn't like this a
Right.
couple of years.
Well,
What?
this is where one of my favorite terms from age 0 to 5 is the three-nager,
Yeah,
where he was a bit of a three-nager. And even as it went away and it's mostly gone now, you do realize that level of fit still exists
coming
in
back,
all of us. Yeah. And
coming
it's
back.
going to come back in a few
Right.
years.
It's gonna
Yes.
go back. And part of that is because, and this is what some of the, neuroanatomical and functional magnetic resonance imaging work has shown is
Hmm.
the forebrain, the part of our brain that is the wiring for doing planning and things like that,
Yeah.
it kind of goes under construction in adolescence.
Yeah.
So it goes offline, actually, literally goes offline. And so there is a neural explanation for why this is happening. It's not because the kid hates you now.
Right.
Is trying to do you dirty.
So
I
if
mean,
I'm
if you
if I'm
feel
hearing you right, you're saying that teenagers become reptiles, if I'm hearing you right.
maybe a little higher on the phylogenetic spectrum, but it's
Okay.
yeah, they're
Yeah.
losing
The
a
reptile
lot of
brain. You're
information.
using the hind brain, not the
Yeah,
forebrain.
yeah, yeah.
Yes.
And
Yes.
so and hence you have impulsive behavior. Kids,
Right.
adolescents don't think it through. You hear that all the time.
Yep.
Why didn't you think it through? And it's like
Right.
the machinery is actually down for the count.
Hmm.
Part of the reason this is valuable as a parent to have in your mind is as the person melts down, slams the doors, screams that you don't love them anymore, all those kinds of things that are going to happen, unfortunately, it's valuable to keep in mind, okay, this is a brain now that's back under development.
Yeah.
The parts that will come back online and help us get to goal are just not working well now. So again, modeling, just it's patience,
Yeah.
it's support. It's not, you don't want to accelerate by yelling back. You actually, even though, yes, you're a human being too, that kind of thing is
Right.
hard to take. You're playing a role. Your use of the term improv is so good. It's like, I got a role here and it's
Yeah.
improv, but it is a role and I got to play it. And it's about support, listening, and not dissimilar to the little person is you got to wait out the storm. You got to wait to have kind of more rational conversations until the storm is over, but
Hmm.
you can be supportive, make sure things are safe, etc. And then the same thing, come back later, a
Right.
day, 2 days later and say, God, that was tough. There was anger and loud words were spoken. And I don't think we got very far.
Right.
Remember what happened? Why did we end up in that?
Right.
And what can we do to not do that again? What can I do? What should you do?
Right.
How do we not do that again if
Right.
we can't figure it out? And it's the same thing. It's modeling that you can talk about these
Right.
things.
And it's also a little bit of a spoiler alert that like we're always dealing with our emotions and
Yes.
frustrations and challenges in life.
Yes.
And that's something that comes up often when we're talking about teachers. One other note I wanted to hit with you before we wrap up on parents
Yeah.
is that the other role that's in this space that you spend a lot of time thinking about and working with is teachers. Any notes on how parents and teachers can work together and how you kind of connect maybe the informal learning at home with the more formal stuff that happens in school? But any thoughts as we close here on how maybe teachers are connected to the conversation?
Yeah. Well, in part, teachers, same thing. How do they handle all those kids and, the emotions that
Yeah.
happen in their classrooms? And so, what you would like is for the parents and the teachers to just have open communications about, was there a meltdown in class? Was there a meltdown in home? What was behind that? What caused that? And then have a conversation about, how do we do some work? How do we get some work to try to make sure that doesn't happen again? Similarly, on the academic front, more and more, I think teachers are beginning to pick up on the science of reading. There's now the reading wars work that's now changed how people are doing. And so there can be some pretty rich evidence grounded conversations between parents and teachers about, what are we doing in class with practice and feedback, and what can you do, and what are you doing at home
Mhm.
with reading out loud, with following along, with additional help to give practice and feedback, where families can do that. I mean, they can't always do that, but
Sure.
where they can actually do that. And so I think there's a lot of, you want to make this a continuous experience around the kid rather than discontinuous, because
Right.
if it's discontinuous, then it's just confusing for the kid. Who am I listening to? And whereas if they both are singing off the same song sheet, then the kids are naturally just hearing it multiple places, and it's going into long-term memory in the most efficient way possible. So
Yeah.
both on the emotional side, but also on the kind of the academic side.
Yeah. I was struck by the serve and return concept also for teachers, I would imagine as well. Can you, that's
Mhm.
the problem when it's a numbers game too. Like how many, if all the tennis balls are coming at you at the same time, you can only pay attention to so many, but trying to catch, the other term I've heard is catch them being good too. Like trying to
Yeah.
find the right things to reinforce and always have the head on a swivel looking for those signals to try to
Yes.
figure those things out. Now, all of this talk of teaching and parenting and kids learning as they grow, it does bring me to the topic of motivation. How do we continue to motivate ourselves to get up in the morning, to continue to power through, do the hard things that we know we need to do? I know this is something you spend a lot of time thinking about, Bror. Can you share with us some of your thinking on the topic of motivation?
Yeah, now it's such an important area because we've been talking a fair bit about like the cognitive science, working memory, long-term memory, but there's another whole dimension of people, and little people too, that you have to pay attention to, which is motivation. And motivation here is what gets people to start, persist, and put in mental effort. So I want to be careful about that definition,
Mm.
because sometimes when people kind of informally talk about what's motivating, they're also thinking, well, do they like what they're doing? Right? Do they like what they're doing? From a learning science standpoint, what will change your brain is if you start, persist, and put in mental effort into well designed learning activities. And liking is one of the reasons you might do that.
Mm.
But in fact, it can be independent. And we know this from sports, we know this from arts.
Yeah.
People don't love the weight room
This
usually,
is
right?
eating your vegetables, right? Yeah.
Yeah, and but I have to do that practice. I have to get stronger. I have to do the scales. I have to be at the bar and for a
Yeah.
dancer. I have to be,
Oh,
doing
when you said you had to be at
practice.
the bar, I
I know,
immediately went to a different bar.
I know, but I
Yes,
immediately added dancing, realizing, oh, hey, got to be careful here. Practice. Well, we won't go there.
that's a whole
So
other conversation.
it's a whole other conversation. But so in fact, we get this already, and no pain, no gain. We have all kinds of phrases and all
Mhm.
that. What's interesting is, we often don't think enough about what gets in the way of people starting, persisting, and putting in mental effort,
Mm.
especially in the worlds of academics and skills connected to work and things like that.
Right.
Uh, and these things are really true across, little kids to grown-ups. Little kids often can be motivated by what makes their parents happy. And boy, is that great secret sauce. That's so much fun, right?
Yeah.
That goes away. And so, you're a 5-year-old. You don't have too many more years left where
Yeah.
that fuel
Enjoy it
that's
while it lasts. Yes.
joy while it lasts, right? But in fact, just like four different things. A really good researcher, Richard Clark, did a review of motivation pieces. And if people want to find these, you can look up my last name, Saxberg, and then Richard Clark and motivation, and they can find the article that's about this. And the four things that go wrong out of his look at many different disciplines of research, behavioral economics, social psychology, motivational psychology, et cetera. One of them is that you don't value what you're doing or why you're doing it. And so, I'm a dancer in a algebra class. I want to think about Swan Lake. I got no reason to think about X's and Y's.
Right.
And in fact, the solution is, how do I link what we're doing in algebra to what's valuable to you, like running a dance foundation? How do you know you have enough money to last over time to pay for the tutus and the theater and all this? It's like, oh, well, that's modeling. That's algebra, right? And so now I have a reason and a domain. And part of this is the domain of a dance company is something I have in my long-term memory. So I understand what it is that I'm talking about. Now I need new skills. And so I'm not trying to learn about a dance company at the same time as I'm trying to learn the new skills. A second thing that goes wrong is I just don't think I'm any good at it. So another dancer, same algebra class, I'm just no good at math. I've had that reinforced to me over many years. It doesn't help to then say, oh, a dance foundation, it's a different problem. So there, the solution is more like, let's show how this algebra work is similar to work you did as a dancer to get good at what you were doing. You started at the beginning and you worked forward. Let's make a plan. Let's figure out where are you at, and let's build practice and feedback so that we dance. And let's tell stories, hear stories from other artists who didn't do any good at math either. But then how did they discover their passion or their capacity for that? What is that like? So that's totally different than the first one of valuing. So,
and that one's interesting also in that I think great teachers frequently are able to make those types of connections and tell those types of stories that translate something that is more abstract or niche or seemingly irrelevant, and then turn this into something that is front and center.
Exactly.
So like the interplay between motivation and relevance is really interesting as well.
Very much so. And spoiler alert, this could be a connection into potential use of AI, but we'll come back to that later. Much later.
Nice.
The third thing that goes wrong with motivation is you blame something in your environment. My teacher hates me. My kids used to say that. And I was like, what does that have to do with your brain? I mean, even that's true. I mean, it doesn't matter. It's just why I don't start, persist, and put in mental effort. My teacher hates me. Or have you seen this textbook? It's totally confusing. So I shut down. Right. Or I don't have space. Or popular among professionals at all levels, I don't have time. Oh, it's important. Oh, I could do it, but I just don't have the time.
Right.
So then I don't start, persist, to put in mental effort. The solution there is problem solve around what you just said. So don't have space. Let's find you a desk. Let's find you a place in a library. Let's find you a spot at schools after school. Don't have time. Let's look at your calendar. Let's figure out how can we move things around and so forth, right? And so part of it is you're also modeling, you can solve this problem. Let's take out the schedule. Let's look at where you work, where you walk, and what's around you, right? So that's the third one. And the last one, which is arguably the hardest one, is negative emotion states. If you are depressed, if you are scared, if you are angry, or post-COVID, if you're grieving, I mean, there's so many families that it is really hard to start, persist, and put in mental effort. And so you really do need to have some support around that. And it may be as simple as a supportive conversation, but it can go all the way to professional help. And that's where school psychologists and all kinds of things become a part of the mix, potentially for families. And so when you're looking at, there's little Bror, he's slumped over sideways again, as he usually is. He's a lump, right? Well, what kind of lump is he, right? That's the point. Is he not valuing the topic we're covering? Does he can't do it? Is there something in his way that he's not able to get going on this? And, or is he just bummed? I mean, is he, out and under stress or whatever it is? Well, now I can have a conversation to figure out what's going on with little Bror and and what we can do. Parents can do this. Teachers can do this, right? But it's a totally different thing. And then designing instruction, as you said before, to kind of pull on the things that are motivating.
Right.
Okay. So you can do this. Let me show you
Right.
why you can do this. Let me show you how it connects to what is, in your world and all
Mm,
that. Let me make sure we clear out space, enough space for you to
yeah.
actually be able to do this, right?
It does also remind me of the coaching dynamic
Yeah,
and tutoring,
very
which
much.
has been a
Very much.
massive trend in
Yep.
education, dating all the way back to the research about the delta, the positive effect of tutoring. But I always thought it was almost more the non-cognitive aspect of tutoring, having like a trusted adult mentor who actually is invested in your success, like that alone, especially for kids who might not have that in their homes.
Exactly.
That kind of stuff can really move the needle.
That notion of being able to support kids both on their academic development, their skill development, but also their kind of emotional development, their resilience, and then motivation to be thinking through how do we keep cross connecting what they're engaged by themselves with the new skills that will help them in the long haul. And I think all of that is in the domain of parents as well as teachers to make a difference.
Yeah, and perhaps that's a positive note too, where it might be a stereotype, but there's a lot of talk about the rising generations being very motivated and interested in causes like the environment and ways to kind of get out and connect in their community, looking for those signals, trying to align that so that we can get folks started on their best paths. It's been amazing having you back, Bror. This is a wonderful conversation. As we conclude here, any final thoughts for our listeners as we wrap up?
Being a parent, as I said, very humbling experience, but there's a ton that you can do to help your kids, develop, feel safe, feel like they belong, and find their interests and passions for the future.
Yeah. And don't be afraid to ask for help, I think is implicit in a lot of this. It's
Absolutely.
hard for all of us, even those of us who seem to be doing well. And hopefully our listeners enjoyed what you heard. If you did, please subscribe, tell your friends, do all the good things. Thanks again for listening. This is Trending in Education.